Moreover, it takes to the limits the idea of what's called process theology. Process theology is just simply the idea that God changes and is still changing. So the second question then also wants to link suffering with the path of perfection. And this is the question. Since suffering and the dark night of the soul seem to be the path to refinement and enlightenment, can we assume God suffers or has suffered, and that could mean God is being perfected? Just want to settle that a bit. It's quite a deep question. I must admit, I found the idea and the question very interesting, and a potential PhD research project if any of you are looking for one. However, I suspect some nuance is needed in clearly defining the type of suffering that is being described, and also the tension between finite and infinite. So on the one hand, we have suffering caused by corrupt and despotic leaders. I wonder where such examples could be. Zimbabwe. Oh yes, America. And also suffering caused by illness and death, loneliness and broken relationships. But this type of suffering is radically different to the suffering that's linked to bliss. So for example, giving birth is painful. I read it in a book somewhere. I heard a rumour. Yet despite the pain, parents are often blissful. And so there is suffering through the birth of a child, but there is also bliss. And so likewise, the suffering endured in the dark night of the soul is fully accepted as part of the bliss of total union with God. I suspect I may need to unpack this language a little bit. What's this person talking about? So, doctors of the spiritual life, such as St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila, are extremely helpful for us because they explain the journey of spiritual maturity. And what they seem to all agree on is that the journey of spiritual maturity is quite similar in pattern to the journey of physical maturity. So you have childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, roughly. I know you have like the Middle Ages, you know, when you're middle-aged, like when you're 70, that's Middle Ages, you know. But roughly it's childhood, adolescence, which for most people is meant to end at about 25, but you know, it's a flexible norm. There's some 40-year-olds that we're still waiting to emerge from adolescence, for example. But roughly childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. And these doctors of spiritual maturity say that these three stages in the spiritual life are called the purgative way, the illuminative way, and the unitive way. Sorry about the language, we haven't changed it since they coined these phrases. But as we journey from stage one to stage, what happens when you move from childhood to adolescence? You know, there's like this huge cocktail of hormones and emotions, and life goes a bit chaotic for a while. And the equivalent, as we mature spiritually, is called the dark night of the senses. So as you move from the purgative way to the illuminative way, there's this dark night of the senses. And what is this about? Well, here, in the dark night of the senses, God withdraws God's presence from us. Like, God can never withdraw God's presence from us, but we feel that the experience of God's presence has been withdrawn from us. And prayers are not answered. And the delights that we once had in prayer and worship are taken from us. No one's had that experience before. It's a time when you feel like you wonder why you're praying, because the prayers just seem to bounce off the roof and smack you across the face. And at the start of a deep prayer journey, there's these experiences of delights and joy. They're quite intoxicating, but it's manipulative. It's there to draw you into the journey, and as soon as you're on the journey, it's taken away. As we move from the illuminative way to the unitive way, there's what's called the dark night of the soul. And this is total and utter desolation. The dark night of the soul is far beyond psychological or emotional pain. It is an existential crisis, and it cannot be treated medically, and it cannot be treated with any therapy. The dark night of the senses and the dark night of the soul sounds pretty grim, but it's a necessary refinement as we wean off our attachment to finite things and open more to the infinite. For the soul that truly desires God, nothing less than God will do. And it is for this reason that the earlier experiences of God's love, the comforts and delights God once gave us, are withdrawn. They are withdrawn to take us deeper into God. It's almost as if God is saying, well, do you want these experiences or do you want me? The suffering endured through the dark night of the soul transforms people totally. That's how you know it is a dark night of the soul. People change radically. The evolution of human consciousness brought about by this infinite love of God releases us from our finite attachments. The whole point of Jesus was to help us trust our union with God, to show us to be open to infinite love. So that's the journey of the pain that we go through the dark night of the soul. Our attachment to finite things like relationships and whatever it is, those are ripped away for us to make us more and more open to the infinite God. And the result of this is transformation. Now, I know you've met people who've gone through this, or you know of people. People often cite cliched examples like Gandhi, but I think the example holds as a person who becomes a mature symbol of a deep spirituality. And for me, another example is Leonard Cohen. God does suffer, but since God is already infinite, I doubt that God has a dark night of the soul. God does suffer, but the suffering of God is God's solidarity with us, not because God goes through a dark night of the soul. And so perhaps some metaphors of God's suffering in solidarity with us may help. And one example I can think of is, some of you are parents, and parents suffer when they see their children in pain. And so this is suffering as a result of solidarity. Or sometimes you may come across a compassionate pastor or counselor or health professional who feels sad because of the pain that you're going through. So I would end by saying I invite you all onto this path of suffering, because it is a joyful path. So I beseech all of you to sell all that you have for this pearl of great price, which is a unity with God that transforms, and to embrace the suffering of the dark night of the soul for the bliss of total union with God. So I need an elegant way to conclude. And so I thought I might quote from Thomas Merton in one of his final journals. And it's based on a poem called Christ of the Burnt Men. So hopefully this gives some gravitas to the ending, using the words of Thomas Merton, who so well describes what I have tried to portray in a rather limping fashion. And he becomes a mouthpiece for God, and he says, so this is God speaking to Thomas Merton, and it's a prayer that he wrote. He hears God saying to him, "You will have gifts, and they will break you with their burden. You will have pleasures of prayer, and they will sicken you, and you will fly from them. And when you have been praised a little and loved a little, I will take away all your gifts and all your love and all your praise, and you will be utterly forgotten and abandoned, and you will become a nothing, a dead thing, a rejection. And on that day, you shall possess the solitude you have so long desired. And your solitude will bear immense fruit in the souls of people you will never meet on earth. And you will become the brother of God and learn to know Christ of the burnt men." So may we each be the brother and sister of God and know Christ of the burnt men.